The gleaming Range Rover rolled to a stop at the edge of Mason Walker's modest auto repair shop, its luxury immediately out of place among the weathered brick building and oil-stained concrete. As the tinted window lowered, Mason glimpsed the face of a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine cover, polished, perfect, and completely lost in this working-class neighborhood of Riverdale. What Mason couldn't possibly know was that this breakdown wasn't merely mechanical. It was the first thread pulling at a tapestry of secrets that had been carefully woven around his family for 25 years. The wrench in his hand was about to unlock far more than just an engine problem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason Walker wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, leaving a streak of motor oil across his sunburned skin. The August heat in Riverdale, Connecticut was unforgiving, especially in his shop where the industrial fans just pushed hot air around like a convection oven. At 42, Mason's hands were calloused road maps of the thousands of vehicles he'd brought back to life over 2 decades. The lines around his eyes had deepened since becoming a single father 5 years ago when his wife Elaine lost her battle with cancer. "Dad, the Hendersons called again about their truck," his 16-year-old daughter Lily announced, leaning against the doorframe between the shop floor and the small office where she helped with paperwork after school. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and despite the grease-stained environment she'd grown up in, she'd somehow inherited her mother's elegant features. "Tell them it'll be ready by 5, Mason replied, sliding out from under Mr. Dawson's ancient Chevy. "And don't forget you have that calculus test tomorrow." Lily rolled her eyes but smiled. "Already studied. I've got this." The phone rang again, and Lily disappeared back into the office, leaving Mason to finish the final adjustments on the carburetor. Walker & Son Auto Repair had been the family business for 3 generations, though there hadn't been a son involved since Mason took over from his father 15 years ago. He'd never changed the name, partly out of tradition, partly because he'd always assumed he'd have a son to pass it on to someday. Life had other plans. The rumble of a high-end engine turning rough interrupted his thoughts. Mason looked up in time to see a glossy black Range Rover autobiography, probably worth more than his entire business, coast unevenly into his lot before coming to a complete stop. The engine sputtered and died with an expensive-sounding rattle. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that typically found its way to his shop. The luxury SUVs from Riverdale's affluent side usually went straight to the dealership in Westport or the high-end specialist in Hartford. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked toward the vehicle, curious. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, her Louboutin heels immediately sinking slightly into the asphalt, softened by the summer heat. She wore a cream-colored business suit that probably cost more than Mason's monthly mortgage payment, her chestnut hair falling in perfect waves around shoulders that were now tensed with obvious frustration. "Is this Walker Auto Repair?" she asked, her voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to getting immediate answers. "Yes, ma'am, Mason Walker," he replied, consciously not extending his oil-stained hand. "Looks like you've got some trouble with your Rover." The woman glanced back at her vehicle as if it had personally betrayed her. It started making this horrible noise on the highway, and then the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. She looked at her watch, a Cartier, Mason noted absently. "I have a crucial meeting in Hartford in 2 hours. "Let me take a look," Mason offered, moving toward the SUV. "Keys still in it?" She nodded, then added, "I'm Alexandra Caldwell. My friends call me Alex." The name sparked something in Mason's memory, but he couldn't place it. Caldwell was a common enough surname, but something about the way she said it made him pause. He shook it off, probably just the name of some client from the wealthier side of town. "Nice to meet you, Miss Caldwell," he replied formally, climbing into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather and a subtle floral perfume. Mason turned the key, and the engine reluctantly groaned to life before producing a distinct knocking sound that made him wince. He revved it slightly, listening carefully, then shut it off. "You've got a serious issue with your timing chain," he said, climbing out. "It slipped, and if you keep driving it, you'll do permanent damage to the engine." Alexandra's perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed. "Can you fix it?" "I can, but not in 2 hours. This is at least a full day's work, maybe 2. 2 days. Her composure slipped momentarily. "That's impossible. I need to get to this meeting, and then I have appointments back to back for the rest of the week." Mason gestured toward the office. "You can use our phone to call a car service. There's a rental place about 15 minutes from here, but they'll need to pick you up." Alexandra pulled out her smartphone. "I'll call my assistant to arrange something." She paused, looking around the shop with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something Mason couldn't quite identify. "Your shop? It's been here a long time. 3 generations, Mason replied with a hint of pride. "My grandfather started it after World War II, then my father took over, and now me." A flicker of something crossed her face. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. But it disappeared so quickly, Mason thought he might have imagined it. "I'll need to get a few things from my car," she said, moving toward the Range Rover. While Alexandra made her calls, Mason popped the hood to assess the damage. The timing chain issue was obvious, but he also noticed signs of neglect. Expensive. Vehicles like this were often serviced like clockwork at dealerships, but several components showed wear beyond what should have been tolerated. "Someone hasn't been paying attention to your maintenance schedule," he commented when she returned. Alexandra slipped her phone into an expensive-looking handbag. "It was my father's. He passed away 3 months ago, and I inherited it along with everything else." There was a heaviness to her words that suggested the inheritance went far beyond a luxury SUV. "I've been too busy sorting out his estate to worry about vehicle maintenance." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mason said automatically, though with genuine sympathy. He knew all too well how grief could make everyday responsibilities seem trivial. Alexandra nodded in acknowledgement. "My assistant is arranging a car. It should be here in 20 minutes. She glanced around the shop again. "You run this place alone?" "Just me, and my daughter helps with the books." "She's 16, Mason replied, closing the hood. "My wife passed away 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Alexandra said, and Mason was surprised by the genuine empathy in her voice. Losing someone changes everything, doesn't it? Before Mason could respond, Lily emerged from the office, her curious gaze taking in the Range Rover and its stylish owner. "Dad," the Pattersons called about their minivan, she announced before introducing herself to Alexandra with surprising poise. "Hi, I'm Lily Walker." "Alexandra Caldwell," the woman replied with a warm smile that transformed her face, making her look younger and more approachable. "Your father is about to save my very expensive paperweight of a car." Lily grinned. "That's what he does best, fixes things most people would give up on." There was a moment of awkward silence before Alexandra's phone chimed. "My car service is 5 minutes away," she announced. "Is there a form I need to fill out or something?" "Lily will help you with that," Mason said, already moving back toward Mr. Dawson's Chevy. "I'll call you with an estimate once I've taken a closer look." In the office, Alexandra filled out the necessary paperwork, providing her contact information and insurance details. Lily efficiently processed everything, handling the customer interaction with a professionalism that always made Mason proud. Through the open door, Mason overheard fragments of their conversation. "So you help your dad after school?" Alexandra was asking. Yeah, since Mom died, someone has to keep the books straight, and Dad's idea of filing is shoving receipts into a shoebox. Alexandra laughed, a genuine sound that carried across the shop floor. Smart girl. Are you planning to take over the business someday? There was a pause before Lily answered. I'm actually applying to pre-med programs next year. Dad's putting away every penny for my college fund. Pre-med, that's ambitious. Mom was a nurse. I want to be an oncologist, Lily said, her voice carrying the quiet determination Mason knew so well. Dad says I'm smart enough to be whatever I want. Sounds like he's right, Alexandra replied, and Mason heard genuine admiration in her tone. Sleek black Tesla pulled into the lot, and Alexandra gathered her things. That's my ride, she said, standing up. Thank you for your help, Lily. It was lovely meeting you. As Alexandra walked toward the waiting car, Mason noticed her pause by the shop's faded sign. She studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before climbing into the Tesla. Once she'd left, Lily returned to the shop floor. She seems nice, different from your usual customers. Mason nodded distractedly, his mind already dissecting the Range Rover's problems. Let's get Mr. Dawson's Chevy finished, then I'll start on the SUV. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine repairs, oil changes, and parts orders. By closing time, Mason had finally gotten around to properly diagnosing Alexandra's Range Rover. The timing chain was indeed the primary issue, but he also discovered problems with the fuel injection system that would need addressing. This is going to be expensive, he muttered to himself as he compiled the estimate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the office, he called the number Alexandra had provided, expecting to reach her assistant. To his surprise, she answered directly. Miss Caldwell, it's Mason Walker from the auto shop, he began formally. Mr. Walker, she replied, her voice warmer than he expected. Please call me Alex. How bad is the damage to my car and my wallet? Mason outlined the necessary repairs and the total cost, which approached $5,000. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's considerably less than the dealership quoted for just the routine maintenance last month, she finally said. I charge fair prices for honest work, Mason replied simply. But it's still a lot of money. I can prioritize the critical repairs if you... No, she interrupted. Do everything it needs. When will it be ready? Day after tomorrow, assuming the parts arrive on time. Perfect. I'll arrange to pick it up then. She paused again. Actually, I have some business in Riverdale that day anyway. Is 3 o'clock convenient? That works fine, Mason replied, curious about what business someone like Alexandra Caldwell could possibly have in the working-class town of Riverdale. After hanging up, he found Lily waiting by the door, backpack slung over one shoulder. Ready to go, Dad. I need to finish that English paper tonight. Mason nodded, locking up the shop and heading toward their 10-year-old Ford F-150. The contrast between his truck and Alexandra's Range Rover wasn't lost on him. Two different worlds that rarely intersected. As they drove home to their modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street, Lily broke the comfortable silence. That Caldwell woman seemed really interested in the shop. She asked a bunch of questions about Grandpa and Great-Grandpa Walker. Mason's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. What kind of questions? Just stuff about when they started the business, if any old photos were hanging in the shop. That kind of thing. Why? Is it weird? No, just curious, Mason replied, but something nagged at the back of his mind. The Caldwell name still triggered something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. At home, their evening routine unfolded as usual. Dinner from whatever Mason could cobble together from the refrigerator. Tonight, it was spaghetti with jarred sauce and frozen meatballs, Lily at the kitchen table with her homework, Mason paying bills at the counter. It was a simple life, but one he'd grown to appreciate in its steadiness. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Mason found himself in the garage, where boxes of his father's and grandfather's old belongings had sat largely untouched for years. Something about Alexandra Caldwell's interest in his family business had awakened his curiosity. He pulled down a dusty box labeled Dad's Shop Papers and began sorting through yellowed invoices, old business licenses, and faded photographs. Nothing seemed unusual until he came across a manila envelope stuffed in the bottom of the box. Inside was a stack of newspaper clippings from the Riverdale Gazette, dating back to the late 1990s. The headline of the top clipping caught his eye. Local business owner in land dispute with Caldwell Development. Mason's father, Robert Walker, was pictured standing defiantly in front of the auto shop, while across from him stood a tall, imposing man identified as Edward Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Development Corporation. Mason's breath caught. Caldwell. That's why the name seemed familiar. He vaguely remembered his father being stressed about something when Mason was in high school. But as a teenager, he'd been too wrapped up in his own life to pay much attention to his father's business troubles. Read further. Apparently, Edward Caldwell had been buying up properties along Main Street in Riverdale for a major redevelopment project. Walker and Son Auto Repair had been one of the few holdouts, refusing to sell despite increasingly generous offers. The article quoted his father. "This shop was built by my father's hands. No amount of money can replace that legacy." Edward Caldwell's response was equally telling. "Progress doesn't wait for sentiment. Riverdale deserves better than outdated businesses clinging to the past." Mason dug deeper into the envelope and found more articles chronicling the dispute, which had apparently escalated when Caldwell Development attempted to use eminent domain to force the sale. The final article, dated just before Mason left for college, reported that Caldwell had suddenly abandoned the redevelopment project for undisclosed reasons, leaving the existing businesses intact. His father had never discussed any of this with him, not even when Mason took over the business years later. Why had Robert Walker kept this conflict a secret? And why had Alexandra Caldwell, who must be Edward's daughter, brought her Range Rover to his shop of all places? Mason sat back on his heels, surrounded by the paper trail of a confrontation he'd never known about. The timing chain in Alexandra's SUV wasn't the only thing that had slipped out of place. The gears of a long-buried history were beginning to turn, and Mason suddenly felt certain that Alexandra Caldwell's appearance at his shop was no coincidence. As he carefully returned the clippings to their envelope, Mason noticed one final document at the bottom of the box, a sealed letter with his name written in his father's distinctive handwriting. Across the front, his father had written, "For Mason, only if the Caldwells ever return." With trembling fingers, Mason broke the seal on an envelope that had waited patiently for him to find it for over 15 years. Mason's hands trembled as he carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. The letter was dated August 17th, 2005, almost exactly 20 years ago, and just weeks before his father had suffered the first of several strokes that would eventually take his life. Mason, if you're reading this, it means that somehow, after all these years, the Caldwells have found their way back to our doorstep. I've debated countless times whether I should tell you this story, but I always convinced myself it was better buried. Now I realize some truths have a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep we try to bury them. Edward Caldwell didn't just want our shop for his development project. What he was really after was something hidden on this property, something that could destroy his family's reputation and fortune, something your grandfather Jacob discovered during the war that he never spoke about to anyone but me. There's a steel lockbox in the foundation wall of the northeast corner of the shop. behind. The old parts storage cabinet. The combination is your birth date, 03-1482. Inside, you'll find documents and photographs that explain everything. Whatever you decide to do with what you find, know that your grandfather and I believed we were doing the right thing by staying silent. Whether that was wisdom or cowardice, I'm no longer sure. With love and regret, Dad Mason read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. His father and grandfather had been hiding something from the Caldwells, something apparently valuable or damaging enough that Edward Caldwell had tried to buy the entire property to get it. He glanced at his watch. 11:30 p.m. Lily was asleep, and he knew he wouldn't rest until he found this mysterious lockbox. Grabbing his keys, Mason headed back to the shop. The night air was thick with humidity as he unlocked the side door of Walker & Son. The familiar smells of oil, rubber, and metal greeted him, but tonight the shop felt different, full of shadows and secrets. Mason flipped on only a single work light, not wanting to draw attention to his unusual late-night visit. The northeast corner housed an ancient metal cabinet filled with rarely used parts, hoses, belts, and fittings for vehicles. So old they barely came through the shop anymore. It had been there for as long as Mason could remember, a hulking presence they worked around but never disturbed. With considerable effort, Mason managed to slide the heavy cabinet away from the wall, revealing a section of concrete that looked no different from the rest of the foundation. He ran his fingers along the surface, feeling for any irregularity, and was about to give up when his hand caught on a slight depression near the floor. Using a pry bar, Mason carefully worked at the section until, with a shower of concrete dust, a square panel about 18 inches across came loose. Behind it was exactly what his father had described, a steel lockbox built directly into the wall. Mason's pulse quickened as he entered his birth date into the combination lock. The mechanism clicked, and the box opened with a reluctant groan. Of metal hinges that hadn't moved in decades, inside was a leather portfolio, its surface cracked with age. Mason carefully removed it and brought it to his workbench, where he opened it under the light. The portfolio contained dozens of photographs, letters, and documents, most yellowed with age. The first photograph showed a much younger version of his grandfather Jacob in an army uniform, standing beside another soldier in front of a ruined building somewhere in Europe. On the back, written in faded pencil, Munich 1945, with Heinrich Kaltenbach. The next several documents were in German, which Mason couldn't read, but among them were what appeared to be banking records and property. Deeds with the name Kaltenbach appearing repeatedly. There were also several newspaper clippings from American papers dated 1947-1948, with headlines like Nazi collaborators' art collection missing and stolen Jewish assets still unaccounted for. Mason's stomach tightened. What had his grandfather been involved in? Deeper in the portfolio, he found a typewritten letter on U.S. Army letterhead, dated December 1946. Walker, your report on the Kaltenbach situation has been received and reviewed. While we appreciate your concerns regarding the disposition of these assets, the official investigation has been closed. As stated in previous communications, the Army has no further interest in this matter. The disposition of any materials not formally catalogued as war reparations falls outside our jurisdiction at this time. I trust you understand the implications of this statement. Regards, Colonel James Westfield, Office of Military Government, U.S. Zone Mason frowned, trying to piece together what he was seeing. It appeared his grandfather had been involved in something related to Nazi looted assets, something that officially had been deemed outside the Army's jurisdiction, but that clearly had troubled his grandfather enough to document and preserve. The final item in the portfolio was a worn leather journal. Opening it, Mason recognized his grandfather's handwriting, though the early entries were dated 1945, long before Mason was born. April 30th, 1945. Munich is in chaos. Our unit has been tasked with securing several government buildings in the city center. Today, Heinrich approached me privately, said he needs help protecting his family's legacy from the Russians, claims his father was forced to work with the regime but secretly helped many escape. Don't know whether to believe him. May 3rd, 1945. Heinrich showed me the hidden vault today. I've never seen anything like it. Artwork, gold, jewelry. He claims it's all his family's legitimate property, hidden to prevent seizure. Something doesn't add up. But he's desperate. Says his sister is all the family he has left. May 10th, 1945. Made a decision I hope I won't regret. Helped Heinrich move the most incriminating ledgers and several small valuable items. The official inventory will show nothing unusual. God forgive me if I'm being fooled. Mason flipped through more entries until he reached one from 1947, October 15th, 1947. Received word today that Heinrich died in a car accident in Switzerland. The package arrived as he promised. Documentation, proving much of the Kaltenbach fortune came from businesses confiscated from Jewish owners between 1938-1942. His note says his sister has taken a new identity in America and is using this wealth to build a new life. He wanted me to serve as his conscience, to ensure restitution is made someday. I don't know what to do with this information. The war is over. People want to move forward. Who would benefit from opening these wounds now? A final entry, dated 1952. Caught Mason's eye, June 8th, 1952. Met Edward Caldwell today, a successful developer expanding into Connecticut. Something about him seemed familiar. Later realized he has Heinrich's eyes. Must be careful if he's who I suspect. The fortune he's building comes from a dark place. We'll keep these records safe. Someday, the truth may need to come out. Mason sat back, stunned by the implications. If his grandfather's suspicions were correct, Edward Caldwell, Alexandra's father, was actually the nephew, or perhaps even the son of Heinrich Kaltenbach, who had helped his family smuggle Nazi-looted wealth to America after the war. The Caldwell fortune was built on stolen assets that rightfully belonged to Holocaust victims or their descendants. No wonder Edward Caldwell had been so desperate to acquire the Walker property. He must have discovered that Jacob Walker had documentation that could expose the true origins of the Caldwell fortune and destroy everything the family had built in America. But his father's letter had mentioned that neither he nor Mason's grandfather had ever revealed this information. They had kept the secret, allowing the Caldwells to thrive while the true owners of that wealth or their descendants might still be suffering. Mason rubbed his tired eyes, overwhelmed by the moral weight that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. What was he supposed to do with this information now? And what did Alexandra Caldwell know? Was her appearance at his shop truly a coincidence, or was she aware of her family's connection to his? The sound of his phone ringing startled him. It was after midnight. Who would be calling at this hour? The screen showed an unfamiliar number. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Mr. Walker? It's Alexandra Caldwell." Her voice sounded different, tense, almost fearful. "I apologize for calling so late." Mason's grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get this number? I gave you the shop line." There was a pause before she replied. "I have resources. Mr. Walker, Mason, we need to talk. And not about my car." A chill ran down Mason's spine. "About what exactly?" "About what your grandfather hid in the wall of your shop." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "About my grandfather, Heinrich, and what happened in Munich in 1945. Mason's blood ran cold. She knew. Somehow. She knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, stalling for time. "Please," Alexandra's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not my father. I've been searching for the truth for years. When my father died, I found fragments of correspondence suggesting Jacob Walker had evidence about our family's past. Breaking down near your shop wasn't an accident. I've been trying to find a way to approach you." Mason remained silent, processing. Her words. "I'm at the Riverdale Inn," she continued. "Room 212. I'll be waiting if you want to talk." The line went dead. Mason stared at the phone in his hand, then at the scattered documents on his workbench. His instinct was to pack everything away, to protect his family from whatever storm might come from these decades-old secrets. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Alexandra Caldwell had sought him out, not to bury this history, but apparently to confront it. Before he could second-guess himself, Mason carefully gathered the documents back into the portfolio, locked up the shop, and headed to the Riverdale Inn. The inn was the closest thing Riverdale had to a luxury hotel, a restored Victorian mansion on the edge of town that catered to the occasional business traveller or wedding party. At this hour, the lobby was deserted except for a half-asleep night clerk who barely glanced up as Mason crossed to the stairs. Room 212 was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Mason hesitated, the portfolio clutched under his arm, before finally, knocking softly, the door opened immediately, revealing Alexandra Caldwell. Gone was the polished businesswoman from earlier that day. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, and she'd changed into jeans and a simple blouse. Without the carefully constructed facade, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and strikingly familiar in a way Mason couldn't place. "You came," she said, stepping back to let him enter, "and you brought them." The room was a standard hotel suite, but Alexandra had transformed the small desk into a makeshift workspace. Papers were spread across its surface, alongside a laptop, and what appeared to be old photographs. "How did you know about the documents?" Mason asked, making no move to hand over the portfolio. Alexandra gestured to a chair. "It's a long story, please sit." Mason remained standing. "I think I deserve some answers before we go any further." She nodded, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "Fair enough. What do you want to know first?" "Start with how you knew about my grandfather and the documents he hid." Alexandra took a deep breath. 3 months ago, when my father was dying of pancreatic cancer, he became confused. Started talking about things he'd never mentioned before. Names, places, Munich, Kaltenbach, Walker. He was terrified that Jacob's boy knew the truth and would destroy everything. At first I thought it was just the morphine talking, but after he died, I started going through his personal files, not the corporate records, but the papers he kept in his home safe. I found references to your family's auto shop and an obsession with acquiring the property that spanned decades. She reached for a folder on the desk and handed it to Mason. There were surveillance photos of your shop from the 1990s, reports on your father, even background checks on you from a few years ago. My father was paranoid that your family would eventually expose whatever secret threatened him. Mason flipped through the folder, disturbed by the evidence of Edward Caldwell's long surveillance of his family. "So, you figured out that my grandfather had something on your family and you tracked me down." Alexandra nodded. "I pieced together that it had something to do with how my grandfather, Heinrich Kaltenbach, became Edward Caldwell after immigrating to America in 1947. My father never spoke about his parents, claimed they died in a car accident when he was an infant, but I found a safety deposit box key among my father's things, and inside that box was a letter from Heinrich to my father, to be opened after Heinrich's death." She moved to the desk and picked up a plastic-protected sheet of paper. It referenced documents Walker has that could ruin us and mentioned the Munich situation. I've spent weeks researching, trying to understand what that meant. Mason hesitated, then placed the portfolio on the desk between them. "I just found this tonight. I had no idea it existed until your Range Rover broke down at my shop and I started digging through my father's old papers." Alexandra stared at the portfolio, her expression a complex mixture of fear and determination. "May I?" Mason nodded and she carefully opened it, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the contents. As she read through the journal entries, tears began to well in her eyes. "I suspected something like this," she whispered. "The timing of my grandfather's arrival in America, the sudden wealth with no clear source, but seeing it confirmed—" Her voice trailed off as she continued reading. "Did you know?" Mason asked quietly. "Before your father died, did you have any idea where your family's wealth came from?" Alexandra shook her head. "No, I was raised in privilege, but with strict expectations. Excellence was demanded in everything: grades, appearance, behavior. My father was difficult, cold. Success was the only acceptable outcome." She looked up at Mason. "But I never questioned the source of our fortune. It was just always there." Mason watched her carefully. "What do you plan to do with this information?" She met his gaze directly. "The right thing, whatever that is." She gestured to her laptop. "For the past month, I've been researching organizations that help identify and return Nazi-looted assets to descendants of Holocaust victims. There are foundations dedicated to this work, even 75 years later." Mason felt something unexpected: relief, and a grudging respect for this woman he'd only met hours ago. "That's not the response I expected from someone who stands to lose a fortune." Alexandra's smile was sad. "Maybe we have more in common than you think. We both had fathers who kept secrets, trying to protect their children in their own ways." She paused. "Your grandfather could have exposed mine decades ago, but chose not to. Your father continued that silence. I want to understand why." Mason sank into the chair, suddenly exhausted. "According to my father's letter, they thought they were doing the right thing. Maybe they believed the past should stay buried, that exposing it would only cause more pain. Or maybe they were showing mercy," Alexandra suggested quietly, "giving my grandfather a chance to make amends in his own way." "Did he make amends?" Mason asked. Alexandra looked thoughtful. "I don't know for certain, but I've been on the board of my father's charitable foundation for years. It's always been unusually focused on Holocaust education and supporting Jewish cultural institutions. The foundation gives millions annually to these causes, always anonymously." She paused. "I used to think it was just a tax strategy, but now—" They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the complicated moral legacy they'd inherited. "So what happens now?" Mason finally asked. Alexandra turned to face him fully. "I think that's something we need to decide together. These documents represent our shared history, a burden both our families have carried. I want to make restitution where possible, but I need your help to do it right." Mason studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity. "Why should I trust you? For all I know, you want these documents to destroy them." "A fair question," she acknowledged. "But think about it. If that were my goal, why reveal myself to you at all? I could have hired someone to break into your shop, or created some distraction to search for the documents myself. Instead, I'm sitting here at midnight, asking for your partnership in fixing a 75-year-old wrong." Her logic was sound, but Mason was still cautious. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We work together to trace these assets, the artwork, jewelry, business interests that were stolen. We identify the rightful heirs where possible. We make anonymous restitution through the foundation." She leaned forward intently. "I don't care about preserving my family's reputation or fortune. I care about doing what's right, what our grandfathers and fathers should have done decades ago. Mason thought of his daughter Lily, her dream of becoming a doctor, her unwavering moral compass. What example would he be setting if he turned away from this chance to correct a historical injustice? "I need time to think," he said finally. "This isn't just my decision. I have Lily to consider." Alexandra nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." She hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing you should know." From her wallet, she withdrew a small, worn photograph and handed it to Mason. It showed a young woman with striking features standing beside a tall man in a U.S. Army uniform. "That's my grandmother Elise Kaltenbach with your grandfather Jacob," Alexandra said quietly. "I found this among my father's things. Look at her, Mason. Really look." Mason studied the photograph, and suddenly the strange sense of familiarity he'd felt when looking at Alexandra made sense. Elise Kaltenbach had the same delicate bone structure, the same distinctive eyes that Lily had inherited from her mother Elaine. "They look similar," he acknowledged, his mind racing. "But that doesn't mean—" "According to my father's records, your grandfather helped Elise escape from Munich with Heinrich," Alexandra said. "They were briefly involved before Jacob returned to America. 9 months later, Heinrich told everyone his sister had given birth to a son, my father, out of wedlock." She took a deep breath. "But I found my father's original birth certificate. It lists Jacob Walker as the father." Mason stared at the birth certificate, the room suddenly feeling too small, too warm. The yellowed document listed Jacob Walker as the father of Edward Heinrich Kaltenbach, born February 12, 1946. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely audible. "My grandfather would have told my father. My father would have told me." Alexandra shook her head slowly. "Would he? Think about it, Mason. Your grandfather returned from war to his wife and existing family. Meanwhile, he'd fathered a child with a German woman, the sister of a man connected to Nazi-looted assets. Would he have admitted that to anyone?" Mason paced the small hotel room, trying to process the implications. "If this is true, then your father was my father's half-brother, which makes us first cousins once removed," Alexandra finished quietly. "Family." The word hung in the air between them. Family. The concept that had defined Mason's entire life, his dedication to his daughter, the legacy of the auto shop, passed down through generations of Walker men, the values his father and grandfather had instilled in him. Now that very concept was being reimagined in real time, expanding to potentially include this woman from a world so different from his own. "Does Lily know?" Alexandra asked, interrupting his thoughts. Mason shook his head. "No one knows. I only discovered my father's letter tonight after you left the shop." "She looks like her," Alexandra said softly, nodding toward the photograph of Elise Kaltenbach. "Your daughter has her eyes. I noticed it immediately this afternoon." Mason recalled the strange sense of recognition he'd felt when he first saw Alexandra, something familiar in her features that he couldn't place. Now it made a disturbing kind of sense. Both Alexandra and Lily had inherited traits from Elise Kaltenbach. "I need to sit down," Mason said, sinking onto the edge of the bed. Alexandra gave him space, moving to the window and looking out at the quiet Riverdale street below. "I understand this is overwhelming. I've had months to adjust to the possibility, and it still doesn't seem real." "Why did you come looking for me?" Mason asked. "Was it just about these documents, or were you looking for family too?" She turned back to face him, her expression surprisingly vulnerable. "Both, I think. When my father died, I was alone in the world. No siblings, no extended family that I knew of, just board members, employees, and people who wanted something from me." She gestured toward the scattered papers. "Finding out about this connection, it gave me something to hold on to, a purpose beyond just maintaining what my father built." "And what exactly did your father build?" Mason asked, an edge creeping into his voice. "A financial empire founded on stolen assets. How much of the Caldwell fortune comes from what was taken from Holocaust victims? Alexandra didn't flinch from the accusation. I don't know the exact proportion, but it's substantial. The original seed money for Caldwell development came from somewhere, and my father's aggressive expansion in the 1970s and 80s was funded by selling what my research suggests were several pieces of looted artwork. Jesus, Mason muttered. I've already started the process of identifying and valuing these assets, Alexandra continued, gesturing to her laptop. The Foundation has the resources to make meaningful restitution, but the research is complicated. Some families were entirely wiped out in the Holocaust, others scattered across the globe. It's not as simple as just writing checks. Mason stood up again, unable to remain still with his thoughts racing. And where does that leave you? If a significant portion of your inheritance is returned to its rightful owners, what happens to Alexandra Caldwell, CEO? A bitter smile crossed her face. I've asked myself that same question. The truth is, I don't know. The legitimate portions of the business can continue. The Foundation's existing good work can go on. As for me personally, she shrugged. I have an MBA from Wharton and 20 years of experience. I'll be fine. There was something in her matter-of-fact tone that Mason found himself respecting, a willingness to face consequences that seemed at odds with what he would have expected from someone in her position. You don't seem like the Alexandra Caldwell I read about in those business magazines at the dentist's office, he observed. The ice queen of commercial real estate who never loses a negotiation. She laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. That persona serves its purpose in boardrooms full of men waiting for me to show weakness. It's not who I am with the people who matter. Her expression sobered, though I haven't had many of those in my life. The vulnerability in her admission struck a chord with Mason. Since Elaine's death, he too had retreated into a carefully constructed persona, the self-sufficient single dad who needed no one, who could handle everything alone. Only Lily got to see behind that mask. It's late, he said finally, gathering the portfolio. I need to get home to Lily. Alexandra nodded. Of course. She's lucky to have a father who puts her first. The simple observation hit Mason harder than he expected. I'm keeping these for now, he said, indicating the portfolio. I need time to think about everything. I understand. But Mason... She caught his eye. We're connected now, whether we wanted to be or not. History has bound our families together. I believe we were meant to find each other and finally make this right. Mason wasn't sure he believed in that kind of destiny, but he couldn't deny the extraordinary series of events that had brought them to this moment. I'll fix your car, he said simply. The rest, we'll see. Fair enough, she replied. Good night, Mason. As he drove home through the deserted streets of Riverdale, Mason felt as though he'd stepped into someone else's life. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been how to afford Lily's college applications. Now he was entangled in a decades-old secret involving Nazi-looted assets, family deception, and moral reckonings that spanned generations. He parked in his driveway, relieved to see the light still on in Lily's bedroom. Despite the late hour, she was likely still up studying, his brilliant, determined daughter who never did anything halfway. Inside, he found her exactly as he expected, surrounded by textbooks at the kitchen table. "Dad!" she exclaimed, glancing at the clock. "Where have you been? I was worried." "Sorry, sweetheart. Something came up at the shop," he said, not quite ready to share the full story. Lily gave him a skeptical look. "At 1 a.m. It's complicated," Mason replied, setting the portfolio down on the counter. "How's the studying going?" "Almost done." She yawned, stretching her arms overhead. "Just one more chapter." Her gaze landed on the portfolio. "What's that?" Mason hesitated. He'd never lied to Lily, not about anything important, and he didn't want to start now. But how could he explain what he himself was still struggling to understand? "It's some old family documents I found at the shop," he said carefully. "Papers that belonged to Grandpa and Great-Grandpa Jacob." Lily's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? Like what?" "Like information about our family history that I never knew about." Mason ran a hand through his hair, suddenly exhausted. "Look, it's late, and this is a lot to get into right now. I promise I'll tell you everything tomorrow. Okay?" Lily studied his face, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but nodded. "Okay, Dad, but you look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired, honey," he assured her. "Finish your chapter, then get some sleep." Once Lily had gone to bed, Mason sat alone at the kitchen table, the portfolio open before him. He reread his grandfather's journal entries, trying to imagine the young soldier faced with moral choices in the chaos of post-war Germany. What would he have done in Jacob Walker's position? His grandfather had chosen to protect a secret that wasn't his to keep, a decision that had altered the course of multiple lives. His father had maintained that silence. Now the burden of truth had fallen to Mason, and he wasn't sure what the right path forward was. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell into a troubled sleep at the kitchen table, his head resting on documents that bridged 2 worlds and 3 generations. The next morning arrived with jarring normalcy, the coffee maker gurgling to life on its timer, birds chirping outside the kitchen window, Lily's alarm clock beeping down the hall. For a disoriented moment, Mason wondered if the previous night's revelations had been a bizarre dream. Then his gaze fell on the portfolio, still open on the table, and reality came rushing back. "Morning, Dad," Lily greeted, entering the kitchen. In her usual rush of energy, she paused when she saw him, taking in his rumpled clothes and the papers scattered across the table. "Did you sleep there all night?" Mason straightened, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. "Apparently so. Not my best decision." Lily poured herself a bowl of cereal, her curious gaze repeatedly drifting to the portfolio as she ate. "So, are you going to tell me what's in those mysterious family documents?" Mason looked at his daughter, so smart, so perceptive, with such a clear sense of right and wrong. She deserved the truth, but he needed to be careful about how he presented it. "It's a complicated story," he began, "and honestly, I'm still figuring out what to do with the information." He took a deep breath. "It involves the woman whose Range Rover came into the shop yesterday." Lily's eyebrows shot up. "Ms. Caldwell. What does she have to do with our family?" Mason rubbed his tired eyes. "A lot, as it turns out. Her father was, well, it looks like he was my father's half-brother." "Wait, what?" Lily's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Are you saying we're related to her? That she's my... what would that make her?" "Your first cousin twice removed, technically." Lily's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally curiosity. "How is that possible? You've never mentioned any Caldwell relatives before." "Because I didn't know," Mason admitted. "No one told me. Great-Grandpa Jacob apparently had a relationship with a German woman during World War II. Her brother was Heinrich Kaltenbach, who later changed his name to Henry Caldwell when he came to America." Lily was now fully engrossed. "So Alexandra Caldwell is, what, Heinrich's granddaughter?" "Yes, and there's more to it than just a family connection." Mason hesitated, unsure how much to share, but Lily's expectant gaze made the decision for him. Great-Grandpa Jacob discovered that Heinrich Kaltenbach had helped hide assets stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. He documented everything, but never reported it. Lily's expression grew serious. Why wouldn't he report something like that? "That's what I'm still trying to understand," Mason admitted. According to these journals, he believed Heinrich was trying to make amends in his own way, but he kept evidence that could have exposed the truth about the origins of the Caldwell fortune. "And now Alexandra Caldwell knows about this evidence?" Mason nodded. She's been looking for it since her father died. She says she wants to use it to identify the stolen assets and return them to the descendants of their rightful owners. Lily studied him intently. Do you believe her? It was the question Mason had been asking himself all night. I think I do, he said slowly. She could have tried to get these documents without revealing herself or her intentions. Instead, she's been transparent about what she wants to do, which is what exactly? Make restitution. Use the Caldwell Foundation to return what was stolen, or provide compensation where direct return isn't possible. Lily considered this. That sounds like the right thing to do. So what's the problem? Mason smiled ruefully at his daughter's straightforward, moral clarity. The problem is that doing the right thing is rarely simple. The Caldwell fortune, Alexandra's inheritance, is built at least partly on these stolen assets. Making full restitution could mean significant financial consequences for her. But she's willing to do it anyway? Lily asked. She says she is. Then we should help her. Lily's tone made it clear she considered the matter settled. Mason wished he could share her certainty. It's not just about the money, Lily. This involves our family too. Great-grandpa Jacob kept this secret. Grandpa Robert continued keeping it. They both chose silence over exposure. Maybe they were wrong, Lily said simply. Mason looked at his daughter, so young and yet so clear-eyed about questions that had kept him awake all night. Maybe they were, he agreed softly. Lily glanced at the clock and jumped up. I need to finish getting ready for school. But, Dad, I think you know what you need to do. She gave him a quick hug before rushing out of the kitchen. Alone again, Mason considered his daughter's words. Maybe he did know what the right course of action was, but accepting it meant acknowledging that his father and grandfather had made a profound moral error in maintaining their silence. He showered and changed, then headed to the shop earlier than usual. Alexandra's Range Rover sat where he'd left it, a physical reminder of how quickly his life had changed. Mason set to work on the vehicle, finding a strange comfort in the familiar tasks of mechanics. Engines, at least, had clear solutions to their problems. Identify the issue, replace the damaged parts, restore function. By mid-morning, he'd made significant progress on the timing chain. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the portfolio and the moral dilemma it presented. By the time he slid out from under the SUV for a coffee break, he'd reached a decision. He called the number Alexandra had used the night before. Mason, she answered on the first ring. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you today. I've been thinking about what you proposed, he said without preamble, about working together to make restitution for what was taken. And? Her voice was carefully neutral. I'll help you on one condition. Name it. Complete transparency. I want to know exactly what assets we're talking about, what your plans are for returning them, and what role the Walker family name will play in all of this. Alexandra's relief was audible. Absolutely. I'm actually at the Foundation offices in Hartford right now, going through some records. Could you meet me here this afternoon? I can show you everything I've found so far. Mason thought of the shop workload, of Lily's after-school schedule. I could be there around 4. Perfect. I'll text you the address. She paused. Thank you. Mason, I know this isn't easy. After hanging up, Mason returned to work with renewed focus. By 3 o'clock, the Range Rover's repairs were complete. A new timing chain installed, fuel injection system serviced, and a thorough diagnostic check revealing no other major issues. He texted Lily to let her know he'd be late getting home, then cleaned up and headed to Hartford in his truck. The Foundation offices were housed in an imposing stone building downtown, its limestone facade speaking of old money and established power. Mason felt distinctly out of place as he parked his mud-spattered F-150 between a Tesla and a Mercedes in the visitor's lot. At the reception desk, he gave his name and was immediately directed to the top floor. The elevator opened directly into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Alexandra stood by a large table covered with papers, her business attire replaced by a simple blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. "You made it," she said, looking up with a genuine smile. "I wasn't entirely sure you would." "Neither was I," Mason admitted, taking in the luxurious surroundings. "This is quite the operation." "My father believed in keeping appearances," Alexandra replied with a hint of irony. "Come, let me show you what I've been working on." She led him to the table where dozens of documents were laid out in neat sections. "These are records of all major assets acquired by Heinrich Kaltenbach between 1938 and 1945, she explained, gesturing to the first grouping. "And these are transaction records showing how those assets were liquidated or transformed after he came to America as Henry Caldwell." Mason scanned the papers, impressed by the thoroughness of her research. "How did you get all this?" "Some came from my father's private archives. Others I've had researchers tracking down in European repositories over the past few months." She indicated another section. "These are the provenance records I've been able to establish for several paintings that were sold in the 1970s and 80s. 3 of them have clear links to Jewish families in Vienna and Prague." As she continued explaining her findings, Mason realized Alexandra hadn't been exaggerating about her commitment to making restitution. The scope of her investigation was extensive, the documentation meticulous. "You've been planning this for months," he observed. Alexandra nodded. "Since I found the first hints in my father's papers. But there were missing pieces I couldn't fill in without the documents your grandfather preserved. And now that you have those—" She met his gaze steadily. "Now we can complete the picture. Identify all the stolen assets, trace their journey, and find the rightful heirs wherever possible. Even if it costs you everything," Mason pressed. Alexandra's expression remained resolute. "The Caldwell fortune was built on a foundation of theft and human suffering disguised as legitimate business. I can't change that history, but I can attempt to correct its ongoing impact." Her words reminded Mason of something his father used to say: "It's never too late to do the right thing." He moved to stand beside her at the table. "Where do we start?" The relief and gratitude in Alexandra's smile was palpable. "With this," she said, pulling out a leather-bound ledger from her father's records. "It's Heinrich Kaltenbach's original inventory of acquired assets from 1939 to 1945. We cross-reference this with your grandfather's documentation to establish clear ownership trails." As they began working side by side, comparing documents and creating a comprehensive catalogue of stolen assets, Mason felt a strange sense of rightness, as though this collaboration was somehow meant to be, a chance to heal a wrong that had festered. Across generations, hours passed as they immersed themselves in the painstaking work of historical reconstruction. Mason was impressed by Alexandra's sharp mind and attention to detail, while she valued his practical approach to problem-solving. They worked well together, their different perspectives complementing rather than clashing. "We need a break," Alexandra finally announced, stretching her arms overhead. "I'll order some dinner. Any preferences?" "I'm not picky," Mason replied, surprised to see it was already past 8 o'clock. While they waited for the food to arrive, they moved to a seating area near the windows. The city lights were coming on below them, creating a glittering backdrop. "I should call Lily. Let her know I'll be late," Mason said, reaching for his phone. Alexandra nodded. "Of course. She's an impressive young woman. Your daughter. You've done a remarkable job raising her." "She makes it easy," Mason replied with a father's pride. "She's got a moral compass that doesn't waver. When I told her about all this morning, she didn't hesitate for a second about what we should do." "You told her everything?" Alexandra asked, surprised. "As much as I understand myself." Mason dialed Lily's number, but the call went to voicemail. That's odd. She always answers. He tried again with the same result, then sent a text message. An uneasy feeling began to grow in his stomach. Maybe she's studying with a friend, Alexandra suggested. Maybe, Mason agreed, though something felt wrong. But she would have told. Me. His phone suddenly rang, not Lily's number, but one he didn't recognize. He answered immediately. "Is this Mason Walker?" An unfamiliar male voice asked. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Officer Daniels with the Riverdale Police Department. Sir, there's been an incident at your home. Your daughter is safe, but you need to come right away." "What do you mean, an incident?" Mason demanded, his heart pounding. "Is Lily hurt?" "Sir, your daughter is unharmed but shaken," Officer Daniels assured him. "There was a break-in at your residence. The perpetrators were apparently searching for something. Your daughter came home from school and surprised them. They fled, but not before ransacking much of the house." Mason gripped the phone tightly, his mind racing. "Where's Lily now?" "She's at your neighbors, the Hendersons. We've taken her statement, but she's asking for you." "I'm on my way," Mason said, already moving toward the elevator. "Tell her I'll be there in 30 minutes. He hung up and turned to Alexandra, who had risen from her seat, concern etched on her face. "Someone broke into my house. Lily walked in on them." The words came out clipped, tension coiling through every muscle in his body. Alexandra's eyes widened. "Oh my God, is she all right?" "The officer says she's not hurt, just scared." Mason jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, as if that would make it arrive faster. They were searching for something. A heavy silence fell between them as the implication became clear. "You think they were looking for the documents?" Alexandra said quietly. Mason's jaw tightened. "It's one hell of a coincidence otherwise. The day after we discover evidence about the Caldwell fortune, my house gets ransacked." The elevator arrived, and Mason stepped in. Alexandra quickly gathered her purse and followed him. "I'm coming with you," she stated firmly. Mason started to object, then reconsidered. If someone was after the Walker family documents that concerned Alexandra's family as well, they were both potentially at risk. "Fine, but I drive," he said, as they reached the lobby. "And I want to know who else knew about these documents." "No one from my side," Alexandra insisted as they hurried to the parking lot. "I haven't told anyone what I discovered in my father's papers, not even my lawyers." Mason unlocked his truck, and Alexandra climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation, her concern for appearances apparently forgotten. As they sped toward Riverdale, Mason called the Hendersons, relief washing over him when Lily's voice came on the line. "Dad!" She sounded younger than her 16 years, a tremor in her voice that tore at Mason's heart. "I'm on my way, sweetheart. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though he could tell she wasn't. "They were gone by the time I realized what was happening. They took your laptop and tore apart your office." "Did you see them? Could you describe them to the police?" "Just a glimpse of two men in dark clothes. They had a van parked down the street." She paused. "Dad, I think they were looking for those documents you found, the ones about great-grandpa Jacob." Mason exchanged a glance with Alexandra. "Why do you think that?" "Because they went straight for your office and the storage boxes in the basement. They didn't touch the electronics in the living room or my jewelry box. They knew what they were after. We'll talk about it when I get there. Stay with the Hendersons, and don't open the door for anyone except me or the police." After hanging up, Mason pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the old truck faster than it was accustomed to traveling. "This doesn't make sense," Alexandra said, breaking the tense silence. "If my father knew about these documents all these years, why would someone be searching for them now?" "Maybe your father wasn't the only one who knew," Mason suggested grimly. "Or maybe someone's been watching you since you started digging into your family's past." Alexandra looked troubled by this possibility. "I've been careful, but my father had associates, people who might have known about the Walker connection and what it meant." Like who? Victor Hargrove, she said after a moment's consideration. My father's longtime attorney. He helped with the estate administration and has access to all my father's private files. Would he have reason to prevent these documents from coming to light? Alexandra's expression hardened. Victor has been on the Caldwell payroll for almost 40 years. His firm handles all our legal matters, including the foundation. If the Caldwell fortune was significantly diminished through restitution, his golden goose would stop laying eggs, Mason finished. They lapsed into silence for the remainder of the drive, Mason's thoughts oscillating between concern for Lily and the implications of what was happening. By the time they reached Riverdale, his grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles had turned white. The normally quiet Maple Street was transformed by the presence of 2 police cruisers, their lights strobing against the night sky. Mason parked hastily across from the Hendersons' house, barely putting the truck in park before jumping out. Alexandra followed at a slightly slower pace, watching the scene with visible apprehension. Lily was sitting in the Hendersons' living room, a blanket around her shoulders despite the warm evening. When she saw Mason, she jumped up and ran to him, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability as he wrapped her in a tight embrace. "I'm okay," she murmured against his shoulder. "Really?" Mason held her at arm's length, checking her over as if to verify this claim with his own eyes. Satisfied she was physically unharmed, he turned to Mrs. Henderson, who stood nearby. "Thank you for looking after her." "Of course," the older woman replied. "You'd do the same for us." A police officer approached, presumably Officer Daniels, the man Mason had spoken to on the phone. "Mr. Walker, we've completed our initial investigation of the scene. If you're ready, you should assess what might be missing." Mason nodded, keeping an arm around Lily's shoulders. It was only then that Lily noticed Alexandra standing a few steps behind. "Ms. Caldwell?" Lily looked confused. "What are you doing?" "Here. I was with your father when he got the call," Alexandra explained, her usual poise momentarily faltering. "I was worried about you." Lily's gaze shifted between Alexandra and her father, clearly trying to make sense of this unexpected development. "We'll explain later," Mason said gently. "Let's go check the house first." The Walkers' home had been transformed in the few hours since Mason had left for Hartford. The front door frame was splintered where it had been forced open. Inside, chaos reigned. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto floors, books pulled from shelves. But it was Mason's small home office that had suffered the worst damage. The desk had been completely dismantled, the computer was missing, and decades of family paperwork lay scattered across the room. "They were thorough, Officer," Daniels observed almost admiringly. "Your daughter says nothing appears to be missing except your laptop. Is there anything else valuable they might have been looking for?" Mason exchanged a glance with Lily, then with Alexandra, who had remained respectfully on the periphery of the scene. "I recently found some old family documents," Mason said carefully. "Historical records that might have some value to collectors." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Mason wasn't ready to explain to the Riverdale police that his house had likely been ransacked because of evidence related to Nazi-looted assets. "Were these documents here in the house?" the officer asked. "No," Mason replied. "They were elsewhere." He didn't volunteer that elsewhere meant the portfolio was currently locked in the trunk of his truck. Officer Daniels made a few notes. "We'll increase patrols in the area tonight. Is there somewhere else you and your daughter can stay, just as a precaution?" Before Mason could answer, Alexandra stepped forward. "They can stay at my suite at the Riverdale Inn. It has excellent security, and I've already arranged for private guards." Mason started to object, but Lily squeezed his arm. "Dad, I don't want to stay here tonight," she said quietly. Looking at his daughter's face, Mason realized this wasn't about convenience or security. It was about feeling safe. Their home had been violated, and Lily needed distance from that. Violation at least for one night. Okay, he agreed. We'll pack some things. While Lily gathered overnight essentials, Mason pulled Alexandra aside in the kitchen, which had been largely undisturbed by the intruders. "You arranged for private security already?" he asked in a low voice. Alexandra nodded. "While you were driving, I called the hotel and upgraded to their penthouse suite, which has controlled elevator access. I also contacted a security firm I trust in Hartford. 2 guards will be on duty by the time we arrive." "That's a lot of precautions for a small-town break-in." Her expression was deadly serious. "This wasn't a random burglary, Mason. Whoever did this knows about the documents and wants them badly enough to risk breaking and entering. That makes them dangerous." Mason couldn't argue with her logic. "What about your attorney, Hargrove? Could he be behind this?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Victor has always been loyal to the Caldwell family, but ultimately he's loyal to the Caldwell money. I'll make some discreet inquiries tomorrow." Lily returned with a duffel bag over her shoulder, her face composed, but fatigue evident in the shadows under her eyes. The 3 of them said goodbye to Officer Daniels, who promised to call with any developments, and headed to the Riverdale Inn. The contrast between Mason's modest truck and the luxury penthouse suite Alexandra had secured could not have been more stark. Occupying the entire top floor of the inn, the suite featured 2 bedrooms, a spacious living area, and panoramic views of Riverdale. 2 stern-faced men in suits stood at attention near the private elevator. "Wilson and Reyes," Alexandra introduced. "Them. They'll be outside all night. No one comes up without authorization." Lily looked around the suite with wide eyes. "This is like something from a movie." "It's just for tonight," Mason assured her, setting down their bags. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out next steps." While Lily explored the suite, Mason took Alexandra aside again. "I appreciate all this, but it feels like we're running from the shadows. We don't even know who's after the documents or why they've suddenly become so important." Alexandra's expression darkened. "I think I might have triggered something. When I started asking questions about my family's origins, looking into the Foundation's finances, requesting access to my father's private records, I must have set off alarm bells for someone. But who would care after all these years? Your father is dead. Heinrich Kaltenbach has been gone for decades." "Legacy," Alexandra said simply. "The Caldwell name still carries tremendous weight. There are board members, business partners, charitable beneficiaries, all of whom benefit from the Caldwell fortune and reputation. If it became public that the Foundation was built on stolen Holocaust assets, the implications were far-reaching. Not just financial consequences, but potential legal and reputational damage that would affect countless individuals and organizations. We need to secure the documents," Mason decided. "Not just for ourselves, but as leverage. If someone wants them this badly, they must be afraid of what we could do with them." Alexandra nodded in agreement. "I have a private safe at the Foundation offices. We can move them there tomorrow." "No," Mason shook his head. "We need a neutral location, somewhere neither of us would be automatically connected to." They were interrupted by Lily, who emerged from exploring the suite. "Dad, have you seen the bathroom? The tub is bigger than our kitchen." Mason managed a smile for his daughter's benefit. "Why don't you take advantage of it? It's been a rough day." Once Lily had disappeared into the bathroom, Mason turned back to Alexandra. "There's a bank in Hartford where my father kept a safety deposit box. I'm still on the account. We could move the documents there temporarily." "That could work," Alexandra agreed. "First thing tomorrow, before anyone realizes we have them." The conversation was interrupted by Mason's phone ringing. It was an unfamiliar number with a Hartford area code. Wary after the day's events, he answered cautiously. "Mr. Walker, This is Victor Hargrove, attorney for Caldwell Enterprises. The voice was smooth, cultured. I understand you've been in contact with Alexandra Caldwell regarding some family documents. Mason's blood ran cold. He put the phone on speaker so Alexandra could hear. How did you get this number, Mr. Hargrove? That's not important, the attorney replied dismissively. What matters is that you're in possession of materials that could be damaging to many important people if mishandled. I'm calling to offer you a reasonable solution to this situation. I'm listening, Mason said, exchanging glances with Alexandra, whose face had drained of color. $5 million, Hargrove stated flatly, in exchange for all documents related to Heinrich Kaltenbach and Jacob Walker. No copies, no records, complete confidentiality. That's a lot of money for some old family papers, Mason replied, stalling. Don't play games, Mr. Walker. We both know what those documents contain and what they could do if made public. $5 million is generous, enough to secure your daughter's education and your retirement. All you have to do is walk away. And from this situation, and if I decline, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Then I'm afraid I cannot guarantee your family's safety. The break-in tonight was just a taste of what could happen. There are powerful interests involved who would prefer these documents never see the light of day. Alexandra leaned closer to the phone. Victor, it's Alexandra. What the hell do you think you're doing? There was a moment of silence before Hargrove responded, his tone noticeably cooler. Alexandra, I'm disappointed to find you with Mr. Walker. Your father spent his life protecting the Caldwell legacy. He would be devastated to see you risking everything he built. My father lied about who he was and where his money came from, Alexandra shot back. I'm trying to make right what he got wrong. Noble sentiments, Hargrove replied with audible disdain, but you're naive if you think this is just about your family's reputation. The Caldwell Foundation funds dozens of charitable organizations, supports research institutions, provides scholarships to hundreds of students. Would you see all that destroyed for the sake of ancient history? Don't pretend this is about protecting charity, Alexandra said, anger rising in her voice. This is about protecting yourself and whoever else has been profiting from my family's secrets. Think very carefully about your next steps, Hargrove warned. Both of you. $5 million, Mr. Walker. The offer stands until noon tomorrow. After that, I can't be responsible for what happens. The line went dead. Mason set the phone down slowly, processing the thinly veiled threat. Well, that answers the question of who's behind the break-in. Alexandra paced the suite, agitation evident in every movement. Victor has been my father's right hand for decades. I knew he might resist changes to the foundation, but I never imagined he'd resort to threats and intimidation. He's not working alone, Mason pointed out. He mentioned powerful interests. There must be others involved who stand to lose if the truth comes out. The foundation board members, Alexandra realized. Several of them have been there since my grandfather's time. They've built careers and fortunes on managing Caldwell money. A chilling thought occurred to Mason. Could they have known about where the money originally came from? Alexandra stopped pacing, the possibility clearly disturbing her. I don't know. Maybe some of them. The older ones, perhaps. She ran a hand through her hair in frustration. God, how deep does this go? They were interrupted by Lily emerging from the bathroom in pajamas, her hair wrapped in a towel. She took in their tense postures immediately. What's wrong now? Mason exchanged a glance with Alexandra, unsure how much to share with his daughter. Lily had already been through enough today, and he instinctively wanted to shield her from further stress. But Lily crossed her arms, her expression resolute. Don't try to protect me, Dad. I'm already involved in this, whether you like it or not. Someone broke into our house looking for documents about our family. I deserve to know what's happening. Mason recognized the determined set of her jaw, so like her mother's when she'd made up her mind about something. Lily wasn't a child anymore, and pretending otherwise wouldn't keep her safe. "You're right," he conceded. "We just received a phone call from Victor Hargrove, Alexandra's family attorney. He offered me $5 million for the documents and threatened us if we don't comply." Lily's eyes widened. $5 million? That's a lot of money. "It is," Mason agreed. "Money that could pay for your college education, secure our future." "But it's blood money," Lily said, surprising him with her immediate understanding. "It comes from what was stolen from Holocaust victims." Alexandra looked at Lily with newfound respect. "That's exactly right, and some very powerful people want to keep that fact buried." Lily sat on the edge of the sofa, thinking. So what are we going to do? The question hung in the air. Mason looked at Alexandra, who seemed equally uncertain. The magnitude of what they were facing was beginning to sink in, not just uncovering a decades-old family secret, but potentially confronting a conspiracy that had protected that secret for generations. "We have until noon tomorrow to decide," Mason said finally. "For tonight we're safe here. We should try to get some rest." But as Lily retired to one of the bedrooms and Mason settled on the suite sofa, rest seemed unlikely. His mind raced with possible scenarios, threats, and solutions. $5 million was a life-changing sum, enough to secure Lily's education and future, enough to expand the auto shop or even retire early. Yet the money felt tainted, not just by its origins, but by the threat attached to it. Taking it would mean complicity in a cover-up that had already spanned generations. It would mean teaching Lily that there was a price at which principles could be sold. Around 2 a.m., Mason heard movement and looked up to see Alexandra emerging from the second bedroom, unable to sleep as well. She wore a hotel robe over her clothes, her hair loose around her shoulders, making her look younger and more vulnerable than the polished businesswoman he'd first met. "I keep thinking about what Victor said," she admitted, sinking into an armchair across from him. "About the foundation and all the good it does. He's not wrong about that part. The Caldwell Foundation funds cancer research, educational initiatives, humanitarian aid." "Funded by stolen money," Mason reminded her gently. "Yes, but does that negate the good it's done?" She looked genuinely troubled. "If we go public with all of this, it won't just affect me or Victor or the board members. It could impact thousands of people who benefit from the Foundation's work." Mason considered her words. "Maybe there's a way to make restitution without destroying everything your family has built. The original victims or their heirs deserve justice. But that doesn't mean everything has to come crashing down." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet," Mason admitted. "But there has to be a middle path between covering up the truth and burning it all to the ground." Alexandra studied him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, you're nothing like I expected, Mason Walker." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone bitter, perhaps, eager for revenge against the family that tried to take your grandfather's business, or someone greedy, ready to exploit this situation for personal gain." Mason smiled ruefully. "I'm just a mechanic trying to do right by my daughter and my conscience. Same as you, in your own way." As they sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thought, Mason's phone vibrated with an incoming text message. It was from an unknown number. "Not everyone on the Caldwell board supports Hargrove's methods. Some of us want the truth told, responsibly. Meet tomorrow 10 a.m. Bartlett Park Gazebo. Come alone. Bring proof." Mason showed the message to Alexandra, whose brow furrowed in confusion. Who could that be?" "Margaret Whitfield," she said after a moment's consideration. "She's been on the Foundation board for over 30 years. My father trusted her completely." Alexandra looked genuinely hopeful for the first time since Hargrove's call. "If Margaret is reaching out, there may be allies we haven't considered," Mason wasn't as optimistic. Or it could be a trap to get us away from the security here. Margaret wouldn't do that, Alexandra insisted. She was always kind to me, even when my father was at his most difficult. If she's offering help, we should at least hear what she has to say. Mason hesitated, torn between cautious pessimism and the need for allies in what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. I'll meet with her, he decided, but you should stay here with Lily where it's safe. Alexandra shook her head firmly. No, if this is legitimate, I need to be there. Margaret respects me. She's more likely to be helpful if I'm present. And if it's not legitimate, we'd both be walking into a trap. Mason's voice hardened. I'm not risking that. Not when Lily could be left alone. The tension between them was interrupted by Lily's voice from the hallway. I'm not a child who needs a babysitter, Dad. Mason turned to find his daughter standing there, clearly having overheard their conversation. How long have you been listening? Long enough, Lily replied, stepping fully into the room. And I think you're both missing the obvious solution. Alexandra raised an eyebrow. Which is? We all go, Lily stated simply, in a public park in broad daylight with the security guards watching from a distance. Strength in numbers, plus you'll have backup if something goes wrong. Mason started to object, but Lily continued, Dad, I'm already involved in this, whether you like it or not. Someone broke into our house today looking for documents about our family. Hiding me away isn't going to change that. Alexandra looked impressed. She makes a compelling argument, Mason sighed, recognizing the determined set of Lily's jaw that signaled she wouldn't be swayed. Fine, but you stay with the security detail, at a safe distance. Deal, Lily agreed, though her smile suggested she considered this a significant victory. As the three of them finalized plans for the morning meeting, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something momentous, a convergence of past and present that would irrevocably change all their lives. Whatever Margaret Whitfield had to share could either provide a path forward or plunge them deeper into danger. Either way, there would be no going back to the simple life he'd known just 2 days ago, when his biggest concern had been how to afford Lily's college applications and fixing the timing chain on a stranger's Range Rover. Bartlett Park sat at the geographical center of Riverdale, a green oasis amid the town's modest commercial district. At 9:45 a.m., Mason parked his truck in the nearly empty lot, scanning the surrounding area for anything suspicious. Alexandra sat beside him in the passenger seat, while Lily occupied the back, uncharacteristically quiet since they'd left the hotel. Wilson and Reyes are in position, Alexandra said, checking her phone. One at the north entrance, one near the playground with sight lines to the gazebo. Mason nodded, impressed by her thoroughness. In the hours since Hargrove's threatening call, Alexandra had transformed from a businesswoman seeking family truth to a strategist preparing for conflict. It was yet another dimension to this woman who continued to surprise him. Remember, he said, turning to Lily, you stay at least 50 yards back near Wilson. At the first sign of trouble, you go with him. No arguments. Lily rolled her eyes but nodded. Yes, Dad. For the 5th time, I understand. The three of them exited the truck and walked toward the park's central area. The morning was bright but cool, with few people around. A young mother pushing a stroller, an elderly man walking his dog, a pair of joggers circling the perimeter path. Nothing seemed immediately threatening. The gazebo stood on a small rise, in the center of the park, its white-painted woodwork gleaming in the morning sun. As they approached, Mason spotted an elderly woman seated on one of the benches inside. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit and a pearl necklace, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob. She exuded an aura of old-money refinement that seemed at odds with the modest surroundings. That's Margaret, Alexandra confirmed in a low voice. I've known her my whole life. Mason nodded to Lily, who reluctantly peeled off toward a bench near the playground where Wilson sat pretending to read a newspaper. Once she was safely positioned, Mason and Alexandra continued toward the gazebo. Margaret Whitfield noticed their approach, her posture straightening imperceptibly. As they climbed the gazebo steps, she offered a tight smile. "Alexandra, dear, and you must be Mr. Walker." Her voice carried the polished cadence of New England privilege. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Whitfield," Mason acknowledged with a nod. "Your message was rather cryptic." "Necessarily so," she replied. "Please, sit. We don't have much time." They took seats opposite her on the curved bench. Mason positioned himself to maintain a clear view of Lily and the park entrances. "How much do you know?" Margaret asked, her gaze shifting between them. "About Heinrich Kaltenbach becoming Henry Caldwell, about the Nazi-looted assets that built the Caldwell fortune, about Jacob Walker's role in covering it up." Alexandra's voice held a challenging edge. "We know enough." Margaret nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Then you understand why certain parties are desperate to keep this information contained." "Victor Hargrove," Mason stated flatly. "Victor is merely the most visible face of a much larger concern," Margaret corrected. "The Caldwell Foundation isn't just a charitable organization. It's a complex web of financial interests, political connections, and corporate alliances built over 75 years. "Who else is involved?" Alexandra pressed. Margaret's lips thinned. "Half the board, key executives in Caldwell Enterprises, 2 sitting federal judges, a senator, and numerous civic leaders who've benefited from Caldwell largesse over the decades." Mason whistled softly. "That's quite a conspiracy of silence." "It wasn't always so elaborate," Margaret explained. "In the beginning it was simply Henry, protecting his new American identity and the assets he'd brought with him. But as the fortune grew and the foundation expanded its influence, more people became invested in maintaining the official narrative." "And where do you fit in this picture?" Mason asked, still wary of her motives. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I joined the board 42 years ago at Edward Caldwell's invitation. I was a young widow with a law degree and connections in Hartford society. Edward needed someone with my background to lend legitimacy to certain foundation initiatives." You know the truth about where the money came from?" Alexandra's question was direct, unflinching. A shadow passed over Margaret's face. "Not at first. By the time I pieced it together, I was already deeply entangled in the Foundation's work. I told myself the good we were doing outweighed the sins of the past. But now," Mason prompted. "Now I'm 81 years old and facing my own mortality," Margaret said simply. "I've spent decades rationalizing my complicity. I can't take that burden to my grave." Alexandra studied the older woman intently. "So you want to help us expose everything?" "Not exactly." Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a slim leather portfolio. "What I want is controlled disclosure and meaningful restitution, not a public scandal that would destroy thousands of innocent lives connected to the Foundation." She handed the portfolio to Alexandra, who opened it to reveal legal documents, financial statements, and what appeared to be a comprehensive organizational chart of the Caldwell Foundation's structure. "What is this?" Alexandra asked, scanning the materials. "A roadmap," Margaret replied. "These documents outline a legal strategy for establishing a separate restitution fund using Foundation assets while insulating ongoing charitable programs. From the fallout," Mason leaned closer to examine the papers. "You've been planning this for some time." "Since Edward's death," Margaret confirmed. "I knew Alexandra would eventually discover the truth about her family's past. I wanted to be prepared." Alexandra looked up from the documents, her expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Why didn't you come to me directly? Why all this cloak and dagger business?" Because not everyone shares my desire for belated justice, Margaret said grimly. Victor and his faction believe the appropriate response is to eliminate all evidence and silence anyone who might expose the truth, like having our house broken into, Mason noted. That was just the beginning, Margaret warned. Victor has resources at his disposal that you can't imagine. Corporate security personnel, private investigators, connections in law enforcement. If he believes you're a genuine threat, there are few lines he won't cross. Mason exchanged a concerned glance with Alexandra. You're painting a pretty bleak picture here. I'm being realistic, Margaret countered. The Caldwell legacy represents billions in assets and generations of influence. People have killed for far less. The starkness of her assessment hung in the air between them. Mason found himself automatically checking on Lily, who sat watching them intently from her distant bench. What do you suggest we do? Alexandra finally asked. Margaret tapped the portfolio. Follow this plan. It creates a legally defensible framework for restitution while preserving the Foundation's core mission. The strategy requires both your cooperation, Alexandra with her position and resources, Mr. Walker with the documented evidence. And what about Victor and his faction? Mason pressed. They're not going to just stand by while we implement this plan. A thin smile crossed Margaret's face. That's why we need to move quickly. There's a quarterly board meeting tomorrow morning. With the right preparation, we can present this plan as a fait accompli, with sufficient board support to isolate Victor. Alexandra looked skeptical. You believe you can sway enough board members to support this? 4 are already on board, Margaret assured her. With your vote and mine, that gives us a majority. But we need the documentation to make the case compelling enough that the others won't fight it. Mason considered the older woman carefully. Her story seemed plausible, her plan thoughtfully constructed. Yet something nagged at him. A lifetime of fixing broken machines had taught him to look beyond the obvious problem for the underlying cause. Why now? He asked suddenly. The Caldwell secret has been buried for 75 years. What's changed that makes this the moment for truth? Margaret's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. As I said, I'm facing my own mortality. No, Mason interrupted. There's something else, something specific that's forced your hand. The older woman assessed him with newfound respect. Perceptive, Mr. Walker. Yes, there is another factor. She glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. The Israeli government's Holocaust Assets Recovery Initiative has recently identified several artworks once owned by the Kaltenbach family. They're tracing the provenance backward and will eventually connect the dots to the Caldwell Foundation. Alexandra inhaled sharply. How long do we have? Months, perhaps weeks, Margaret replied. Victor's sources alerted him to the investigation 3 months ago. That's when the faction split formed on the board, those like myself who advocate for proactive disclosure and restitution versus those who prefer more aggressive countermeasures. The pieces were falling into place for Mason. So, Victor's desperation to get the Walker documents isn't just about protecting the past. It's about preventing evidence that could support this Israeli investigation. Precisely, Margaret confirmed. Your grandfather's documentation provides the missing link that could definitively prove the connection between Heinrich Kaltenbach and Henry Caldwell, between looted assets and the Caldwell fortune. Alexandra was already leafing through Margaret's portfolio, her business acumen engaged. This plan is comprehensive. Specialized legal structures, financial mechanisms I've never seen before. I've had help, Margaret admitted. Discreet experts with experience in Holocaust asset restitution cases. The goal is to make this right without destroying everything the Foundation has built. Mason remained cautious. And you're certain the other board members you've mentioned will support this approach? As certain as one can be in these circumstances, Margaret replied. Self-interest is a powerful motivator. The plan includes immunity provisions for board members who cooperate fully. A movement in Mason's peripheral vision caught his attention. A black SUV had pulled into the park's parking lot, not a Range Rover like Alexandra's, but a Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows. Something about it raised his internal alarm. "We may have company," he muttered, nodding subtly toward the vehicle. Margaret followed his gaze and tensed visibly. "That's Victor's car. We need to go, now." Alexandra gathered the portfolio as Mason scanned for Lily, relieved to see Wilson already moving to her side, his casual demeanor replaced by alert professionalism. "Take these," Margaret said urgently, pressing a USB drive and a business card into Alexandra's hand. The drive contains digital copies of everything in the portfolio, plus meeting minutes that demonstrate Victor's awareness of the Foundation's origins. The card has a secure contact number. Call it tonight at 8. They descended the gazebo steps quickly, Mason keeping himself between the women and the approaching Escalade. As they reached the path, the SUV's doors opened, and 3 men in business suits emerged, Victor Hargrove among them. "Alexandra," Hargrove called, his voice carrying across the park. "A word, please." "Keep walking," Margaret instructed under her breath. "My car is at the south entrance." Mason spotted Reyes moving to intercept Hargrove's group, buying them precious seconds. "Lily," he called, gesturing for his daughter to join them. She hurried over, eyes wide with apprehension. "What's happening?" "Change of plans," Mason explained tersely, guiding her along the path that curved toward the south end of the park. "We're leaving with Mrs. Whitfield." Hargrove's voice rose behind them. "This is a terrible mistake, Alexandra. We can still resolve this privately." They quickened their pace, Lily keeping up admirably despite her confusion. Margaret led them to a silver Mercedes parked just outside the park's wrought iron fence. "Get in," she urged, unlocking the doors with a remote. Mason hesitated, years of caution making him wary of entrusting their safety to this woman he'd just met, regardless of her apparent sincerity. "Dad," Lily said quietly, "Mr. Hargrove is coming." The attorney was indeed approaching rapidly, having circumvented Reyes somehow. His normally composed features were tight with barely controlled anger. "Go with Mrs. Whitfield," Mason decided, opening the back door for Alexandra and Lily. "I'll delay. Hargrove and meet you later." "Mason?" "No," Alexandra began, but he closed the door firmly. "Go," he instructed Margaret, who nodded grimly and slid into the driver's seat. As the Mercedes pulled away, Mason turned to face Victor Hargrove, who slowed his approach upon realizing his quarry was escaping. "Mr. Walker," Hargrove greeted him, with cold formality. "I believe we had until noon to discuss my offer." "I decided early," Mason replied evenly. "The answer is no." Hargrove's polished veneer cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. This goes far beyond a family secret or moral qualms about ancient history." "So I'm learning," Mason acknowledged, maintaining a safe distance between them. "Funny how Holocaust asset theft doesn't seem like ancient history to the families who never received justice." The attorney's eyes narrowed. "Justice is a luxury, Mr. Walker. What we're protecting is stability, financial systems, charitable works, institutional relationships, built over decades. Would you sacrifice all that for abstract principles?" "I'm a simple mechanic," Mason replied, a hint of irony in his tone. "I fix things that are broken. And from where I'm standing, the Caldwell Foundation needs some serious repairs." Hargrove's expression hardened. "Margaret Whitfield is not the ally you think she is. She has her own agenda in all this, one that may not align with your noble intentions or Alexandra's naive idealism." The statement gave Mason pause. "What do you mean?" "Did she tell you about her son?" Hargrove asked, a calculating gleam in his eye. "About his position on the board of Whitfield Holdings?" which manages over 30% of the Foundation's investment portfolio. About the management fees that would vanish if the Foundation's assets were significantly diminished. Mason kept his expression neutral, though the information was new to him. Everyone has competing interests in this situation, including you. The difference, Hargrove pressed, is that I'm being transparent about those interests. $5 million, Mr. Walker. That offer still stands. Transparent about buying my silence, maybe, Mason countered, but not about who else is involved or what they're really protecting. A sleek black sedan pulled up behind Hargrove, and one of his associates stepped out, whispering something in the attorney's ear. Hargrove's expression shifted almost imperceptibly before he focused again on Mason. It seems Alexandra and your daughter are headed to the Caldwell estate in Westport, he said smoothly. An interesting choice on Margaret's part. Mason's stomach tightened. He'd assumed Margaret would take them somewhere in Hartford near the Foundation offices. Westport was in the opposite direction, over an hour away on the coast. What's in Westport? He asked, trying to keep his voice level. The family seat, Hargrove replied, where Edward Caldwell maintained his private office and personal archives. It's also where Heinrich Kaltenbach spent his final years living in the guest house under the name Uncle Henry. The revelation added yet another layer to the already complex situation. Mason fought to maintain his composure, not wanting Hargrove to sense his growing concern about Lily's whereabouts. If you'll excuse me, Mason said, taking a step back. I have a car to repair. Alexandra's Range Rover? Hargrove smiled thinly. Already taken care of. A Caldwell Enterprises fleet mechanic picked it up from your shop an hour ago, paid your invoice in full, plus a generous gratuity. The casual demonstration of reach and resources was clearly intended to intimidate. Mason refused to give Hargrove the satisfaction of appearing unsettled. Then I have other cars waiting, he replied, continuing his backward progress toward his truck. One last thing, Mr. Walker, Hargrove called after him. Whatever Margaret has told you, whatever documentation she's provided, ask yourself who benefits most from her particular version of controlled disclosure. The answer might surprise you. With that cryptic warning, the attorney returned to his waiting Escalade, leaving Mason with more questions than answers. In his truck, Mason immediately tried calling Alexandra, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried Lily next, with the same result. Fighting down rising panic, he called the security firm Alexandra had hired, using the contact information she'd shared with him the night before. This is Meridian Security, a professional voice answered. This is Mason Walker. He identified himself with the code phrase Alexandra had established. I'm trying to reach Wilson or Reyes, who were providing protective services to Alexandra Caldwell. One moment, sir. After a tense wait, a different voice came on the line. Mr. Walker, this is Matthews, operations supervisor. We've lost contact with both Wilson and Reyes within the last 20 minutes. Their GPS trackers show them still at Bartlett Park, but they're not responding to calls. Mason's blood ran cold. What about Ms. Caldwell? Are you tracking her? We have a beacon on her phone, but it's currently inactive. Last signal placed her moving eastbound on Route 15 approximately 30 minutes ago, toward Westport, confirming Hargrove's information. Mason gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing himself to think clearly, despite his mounting fear. I need an address for the Caldwell estate in Westport, he said. Sir, if there's a potential security situation, we should dispatch a team. The address, Mason interrupted firmly, and any information you have on Margaret Whitfield. There was a brief hesitation before Matthews replied, The Caldwell estate is at 427 Shoreline Drive in Westport. As for Margaret Whitfield, she's listed in our database as an approved contact for Ms. Caldwell, security clearance level 2. What does that mean exactly? It means Ms. Caldwell has previously authorized Mrs. Whitfield to access secure areas and information, but not to make security decisions on her behalf. Mason processed this information, trying to reconcile it with Hargrove's insinuations about Margaret's motives. Both Hargrove and Margaret clearly had their own agendas, but which one posed the greater threat to Alexandra and Lily? "Sir," Matthews continued, "I've dispatched a team to investigate Wilson and Rhea's status and another to the Westport address. They'll be there in approximately 45 minutes. "I'll be there sooner," Mason replied, starting his truck. "And, Matthews, if anyone from Caldwell Enterprises or someone named Victor Hargrove contacts your firm, tell them nothing." "Understood, sir." As Mason pulled onto the highway toward Westport, his mind raced through possible scenarios. Had Margaret genuinely taken Alexandra and Lily to safety, or was she serving some agenda Mason couldn't yet discern? Was Hargrove simply trying to sow distrust, or had he revealed a legitimate concern? Most pressingly, why weren't Alexandra and Lily answering their phones? The Westport address was programmed into his GPS, showing an estimated arrival time of 11:37 a.m. Mason pushed his old truck harder than it was accustomed to traveling, shaving precious minutes off that projection. As he drove, he recalled something his father had told him years ago. "When you're working on a complex problem, son, don't just focus on the obvious broken part. Look at the whole system. Sometimes what looks like the problem is just a symptom of something broken elsewhere." The wisdom seemed particularly relevant now. Mason had been focusing on the documents, on the historical secret they revealed, but perhaps the real issue lay in the present, in the complex web of financial interests, power structures, and personal agendas that had grown around that original sin. His phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. Mason answered immediately, hoping for news from Alexandra or Lily. Mason Walker, a woman's voice, but not one he recognized. "Who is this?" he demanded. "My name is Rachel Goldstein. I'm with the Holocaust Assets Recovery Initiative. We need to talk about Heinrich Kaltenbach and the Caldwell Foundation." Mason nearly swerved in surprise. "How did you get this number?" "From Margaret Whitfield," Rachel replied. "She contacted me this morning, said you and Alexandra Caldwell have documentation we've been seeking for years." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret hadn't just been preparing for the Israeli investigation, she'd been actively cooperating with it. "Where are Alexandra and my daughter?" Mason asked directly. "I don't know," Rachel admitted, sounding concerned. "Margaret was supposed to bring them to a secure meeting location after contacting you. She hasn't checked in." Mason's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I'm headed to the Caldwell estate in Westport. That's where I believe she's taken them." "The estate?" Rachel sounded alarmed. "That wasn't the plan. Our meeting was arranged at our legal team's offices in New Haven." The divergence confirmed Mason's growing suspicion that something had gone very wrong. "How quickly can you get to Westport?" "I'm in New Haven now. I can be there in 30 minutes. "Meet me at 427 Shoreline Drive," Mason instructed. "And Ms. Goldstein, bring whatever authorities you can trust. I think my daughter and Alexandra Caldwell may be in danger." As he ended the call, Mason pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck to its limits. The coastline was now visible in the distance, the exclusive enclave of Westport drawing closer with each passing minute. Whatever was waiting for them at the Caldwell estate, Mason was determined to face it head-on. Lily and Alexandra's safety depended on it, and perhaps in some cosmic balance of justice, so did the ghosts of the past that had set this whole chain of events in motion. The Caldwell estate loomed against the coastline like something from another era, a sprawling colonial revival mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and a stone wall that separated it from neighboring properties. As Mason approached the ornate iron gates, he was struck by the stark contrast between this world of privilege and his modest life in Riverdale. The gates stood partially open, an immediate red flag. Mason slowed his truck, scanning for any sign of Margaret's silver Mercedes or security personnel. Finding neither, he cautiously drove through the entrance and up the curved driveway, gravel crunching beneath his tires. He parked behind a hedge that offered some concealment, then checked his phone. Still no response from Alexandra or Lily, and Rachel Goldstein had texted that she was 15 minutes away. Mason debated waiting for her, but quickly dismissed the idea. Every moment his daughter remained unaccounted for felt like an eternity. The mansion's front door was unlocked, another warning sign. Mason entered silently, finding himself in a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of pristine silence that spoke of wealth and absence. "Lily?" he called, his voice echoing through the space. "Alexandra?" No response. Mason moved deeper into the house, passing through formal rooms filled with antiques and artwork that now took on a sinister significance given what he knew about the Caldwell fortune's origins. He found himself cataloguing pieces that might have been looted. A gilt-framed landscape, a porcelain collection, silver candelabras bearing ornate monograms. A sound from the rear of the house drew his attention. The faint murmur of voices. Mason followed it through a sun-filled conservatory to a set of French doors that opened onto a stone terrace overlooking Long Island Sound. Through the glass, he could see 4 figures, Alexandra and Lily seated at an outdoor table, with Margaret standing nearby. The 4th person was an elderly man in a wheelchair, whose frail appearance contrasted with his alert, piercing gaze. They appeared to be engaged in intense conversation, with no signs of immediate danger. Mason pushed open the doors, and all 4 heads turned toward him. "Dad!" Lily jumped up, relief flooding her features. "Mason!" Alexandra echoed, equally relieved. "Thank God you're here." Margaret looked unsurprised, almost as if she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Walker, please join us. We've been having a most enlightening conversation." The elderly man studied Mason with unnerving intensity. "So, you're Jacob's grandson," he said, his voice surprisingly strong, despite his fragile appearance. "There's a resemblance." Mason moved protectively to Lily's side. "Who are you?" "This is Richard Caldwell," Margaret explained, "Edward's younger brother. He's been living in the guest house since his retirement 20 years ago." The name triggered no immediate recognition for Mason, neither his father's letter nor his grandfather's. Journals had mentioned a second Caldwell brother. "Richard is actually Heinrich Kaltenbach, Jr., Alexandra added, watching Mason's reaction carefully. Edward wasn't the only child who came to America after the war. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Heinrich had 2 sons. Richard nodded slowly. "My brother Eric, who became Edward, was 10 when we left Germany. I was only 4, too young to remember much of our life before America, too young to understand what our father had done." Mason turned to Lily, checking her for any signs of distress. "Are you okay? Why haven't you answered your phone?" "No cell service in this part of the property," Lily explained. "And I'm fine, Dad. Better than fine. I've been learning our family. History, the real history. Why did you bring them here?" Mason demanded of Margaret. "The plan was New Haven, not Westport." Margaret's expression remained composed. "Plans changed when I realized Victor had surveillance on us at the park. Richard needed to be part of this conversation. He's the last living link to Heinrich Kaltenbach, the only person who can verify certain details about what happened after the war." Mason remained wary. "Hargrove suggested you have your own agenda in all this." "Of course I do," Margaret acknowledged frankly. "I've spent 40 years of my life serving the Caldwell Foundation. I want to see it survive in some form, even as we make restitution for its origins." "And what about your son's company managing foundation investments?" Mason pressed. Hargrove mentioned that too. A flicker of irritation crossed Margaret's features. "Victor is grasping at straws. Yes, my son's firm manages some foundation assets, but he recused himself from all discussions about this matter. Unlike Victor, some of us can separate personal interest from ethical imperatives. Richard Caldwell cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand. I understand you have my father's documents, Mr. Walker. Mason nodded cautiously. I have the portfolio my grandfather preserved. And I have something to add to it, Richard said, gesturing to a leather folder on the table. My own records of what happened after we came to America, how the assets were transformed, laundered through legitimate businesses used to build the Caldwell name. Alexandra leaned forward. Uncle Richard has been keeping his own documentation for decades, Dad. He always knew the truth, but felt powerless to act while his brother was alive. The familiarity with which Alexandra addressed Richard, Uncle Richard, suggested they'd established some rapport in the brief time before Mason's arrival. I was the family disappointment, Richard explained with a bitter smile. The sickly younger son who lacked Edward's ruthless business instincts. My brother kept me comfortable, but marginalized, a family embarrassment tucked away in the guest house, dependent on his generosity. But you knew everything, Mason observed. Richard nodded. I knew, and I documented, and I waited. For what? I wasn't entirely sure until Alexandra appeared at my door this morning with your daughter and Margaret. The mention of waiting resonated. With Mason, his own grandfather and father had also waited, preserving evidence while taking no direct action. 3 generations of men, each burdened with knowledge they couldn't quite bring themselves to use. I made a call while you were en route, Margaret interjected. Rachel Goldstein from the Holocaust Assets Recovery Initiative should be joining us shortly. As if on cue, the sound of tires on gravel announced a new arrival. Minutes later, Rachel Goldstein appeared on the terrace, a formidable woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated her life to a cause. Mrs. Whitfield, she acknowledged Margaret before turning to the others. Ms. Caldwell, Mr. Walker. Her gaze lingered on Richard. And you must be Heinrich Kaltenbach, Jr. Richard inclined his head. I've gone by Richard Caldwell for 75 years, but yes, Rachel set her briefcase on the table. I've been tracking your father's activities for over a decade, Mr. Caldwell. The Goldstein family collection was among those looted by the Reich's art appropriation programs. 3 paintings that once hung in my grandfather's home in Vienna ended up in the Kaltenbach inventory. The personal connection added yet another dimension to the already complex situation. This wasn't merely about abstract justice or financial restitution. It was about real families whose lives and legacies had been shattered. Show them, Richard instructed Margaret, who opened her laptop and turned it to face the group. On the screen appeared a secure document-sharing platform containing hundreds of files, financial records, property deeds, provenance documentation, for artwork and valuables, correspondence between Heinrich Kaltenbach and various officials in post-war Germany and America. This is everything, Margaret explained. Richard has been digitizing his records for years. Combined with the Walker documents and the Foundation's own archives, we now have a complete picture of the assets that formed the basis of the Caldwell fortune. Rachel studied the screen with professional focus. This is extraordinary. We've been piecing this together for years, but there were always missing links. And now, Mason asked, what happens with all this information? Alexandra straightened her shoulders, a new resolve evident in her posture. Now we do what should have been done decades ago. We create a comprehensive restitution program, identifying the original owners or their descendants wherever possible. The Foundation will survive, Margaret added, but in a transformed state. Its mission will explicitly include Holocaust education and justice initiatives funded by legitimately acquired assets. Richard nodded slowly. It won't undo what my father did. Nothing can. But perhaps it can finally break the cycle of secrecy and complicity that has poisoned 3 generations of both our families. What about Hargrove and his faction? Mason asked. They won't simply stand down. Margaret's expression hardened. Victor overplayed his hand with the break-in and threats. I've already spoken with key board members who were unaware of his methods. With Richard's testimony and these documents, Victor's position is untenable. And if he escalates? Mason. Pressed, Rachel interjected. The Israeli government takes a rather dim view of attempts to obstruct Holocaust asset recovery. If necessary, we can involve international authorities. As the conversation continued, Mason found himself watching Lily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. She caught his eye and gave him a small smile, not the carefree smile of the girl she'd been days ago, but something more measured, more aware. You okay with all this? He asked softly, moving to sit beside her. It's a lot, she admitted, but it feels right, Dad. Great-Grandpa Jacob could have exposed everything back in 1945, but he chose silence. Grandpa Robert continued that silence. You have the chance to make a different choice. Mason was struck by the wisdom in her words. When did you get so grown up? Probably around the time someone broke into our house, she replied with a hint of her usual humor. Alexandra joined them, leaving Margaret and Rachel deep in technical discussion with Richard. Your daughter is remarkable, Mason. She's been asking all the right questions, better ones than I did when I first learned the truth. Mason felt a surge of paternal pride. She's going to make an amazing doctor someday. About that, Alexandra said, her expression softening. I've been thinking about my role in all this going forward. Once the restitution process is established, the foundation will need new leadership, people without the baggage of the Caldwell name. Are you planning to step down? Mason asked, surprised. Eventually. But first, I want to establish a medical scholarship program as part of our restructuring, specifically for students committed to serving vulnerable populations. She glanced meaningfully at Lily. Your daughter would be an ideal first recipient. The offer caught Mason off guard. Alexandra, that's not charity, she interrupted firmly, and not an attempt to buy goodwill. It's about creating something positive from all this, a legacy that looks forward instead of back. Before Mason could respond, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, they could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to the mansion. Victor, Margaret said grimly, rising from her seat. Rachel closed her laptop. I've already transmitted key documents to my team. If he's planning something drastic, it's too late. Mason moved protectively toward Lily, but Alexandra placed a calming hand on his arm. It's all right, she said with surprising confidence. I suspected he might track us here. That's why I made a call of my own on the way. As the front doors opened and footsteps approached, Victor Hargrove appeared at the terrace entrance, flanked by 2 security personnel. His customary polish had given way to barely contained fury. This is a serious mistake, he began, but stopped short at the sight of Richard Caldwell. Hello, Victor, Richard said mildly. We were just discussing your unauthorized initiatives. Regarding family matters, Hargrove's composure faltered. Mr. Caldwell, Save it, Alexandra interrupted, rising to her full height. The board chairman is already on his way, along with representatives from the State Attorney General's office. Breaking and entering, threatening a minor, attempted extortion. You've been busy, Victor? As if to confirm her words, another vehicle appeared in the driveway. A town car flying small flags on its hood that indicated official government transportation. Hargrove's face drained of color as he realized his position was untenable. Alexandra, be reasonable. Everything I've done has been to protect the Caldwell legacy. No, she corrected him firmly. Everything you've done has been to protect your own interests and position. The true Caldwell legacy begins today with honesty and restitution. As Hargrove was escorted from the terrace by newly arrived officials, Mason found himself standing with Alexandra, Lily, and Richard Caldwell, 4 people connected by a complex web of history, secrets, and now, a shared commitment to long overdue justice. What happens now? Lily asked, watching the flurry of activity as more officials arrived and began cataloguing documents. Richard Caldwell reached for her hand, his eyes, so similar to her own, glistening with emotion. Now, my dear, we finally tell the truth. All of it, and then we begin the hard work of making amends. Alexandra turned to Mason, her expression both weary and hopeful. I still can't believe a broken timing chain led to all of this. Mason smiled, thinking of all the unexpected connections that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes what seems broken is actually the first step toward fixing something much bigger. As the sun began to set over Long Island Sound, casting golden light across the terrace, Mason felt the weight of 3 generations of secrets finally lifting. Whatever challenges lay ahead in implementing the restitution plan, in reshaping the Caldwell Foundation, in integrating these newfound family connections into their lives, they would face them together, with the truth finally in the open where it belonged. In the end, what had begun with a wealthy woman's broken SUV had led to the repair of something far more fundamental, a moral engine that had been quietly failing for 75 years, awaiting the right hands to finally fix what had been broken all along. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.